I'm Shari Guilfoile, and today we're talking about how to help people bring faith into everyday life. And I've asked Michael Wright to join us, and partly because of who he is and also who he isn't. He is an everyday guy who isn't afraid to talk about his faith. He's not an author, he's not a theologian, he's not a member of the clergy, not that there's anything wrong with any of those, but he just lives in everyday life with everyday people, just like the rest of us do, and that's where our faith needs to work. So, Michael, thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure, Shari.
And I also want to point out that it's not like you've spent your whole career in one place so that you're just like really comfortable and that's why you do this, because you've worked for 2 of the auto companies, 2 major ad agencies. You're currently Vice President of Marketing and Communication for Wayne State University, which is a large public university here in Detroit, Michigan.
Correct.
And I can also say that I can attest to Michael's effectiveness in doing this, because Michael and I about 10 or 12 years ago worked together briefly, but for a time. So I got to see what you do. So here's where I'd like to start so that everybody's on the same page. What does an opportunity to talk about faith in a secular workplace look like?
I think, Shari, all day long we have opportunities to talk about faith, and you wouldn't think so. We're not a culture that encourages that sort of behavior, but somebody sneezes, you say, God bless you. You sit down to dinner and you say prayers. You look at the headlines and you find that there are all kinds of things that find their way into the conversation that can be an opening to talk about faith. Sometimes it takes a little bit of courage to do it. But if you look at the headlines, they're talking about the Pope these days. He's like a rock star in the communities. Well, he's talking about things that are important. When you get past the headlines and you get past the fun of it all, you can ask a question. Sometimes it's just about listening, asking, and then just probing.
So along those lines, what works? What are some do's or don'ts?
Well, we're in a world where people can be very fundamentalist with their faith, with their politics, with a lot of things. If you try to convince them, forget about it. It's not going to work. They're generally going to become defensive. If you just ask questions, sometimes people will explain why they think a certain way. Sometimes people only think a certain way because others have told them to think a certain way, and when you probe past 1 or 2 questions, you find there's maybe not a whole lot there.
Right. And it's not about trying to convert anybody to anything. No. It's just about trying to bring it into their life so that they can, so it's effective, right? Yeah. I mean, if we just leave our faith in church, if we think it just belongs there, and life happens over here, we've kind of missed the opportunity, what it's all about.
We live in a secular society. We have enshrined the separation of church and state in the founding documents of the country. But I think some people take that a little bit too far. They think that we shouldn't ever talk about faith. Now, we'll talk about everything else. We'll talk about the weather. We'll talk about football. We'll talk about basketball. We've created an entire society of diversions to talk about, but they're not the most important things to talk about. Yeah. So for me, my faith is the source of great joy, and that's something you want to share. I mean, if you see a great movie, you want to tell people, you want them to watch that movie. Well, why wouldn't we do that with faith? Well, we're real kind of tight about that. We don't want to make people feel uncomfortable. We don't want to make ourselves feel uncomfortable, so we're hesitant to get into discussions about things that are really the most important things that we have to discuss.
Let me ask you this, speaking of uncomfortable. So do you have any friends or coworkers that are atheists or agnostic?
Yep, I do.
Okay, so how do you make sure that they don't feel alienated when you...
It's just about having a conversation that's comfortable. In fact, we have a group that gets together on Friday mornings, and we discuss all sorts of things, not normally religious, more about ideas. And this person has professed their atheism. And first you just have to accept it. Say, hey, that's cool. You are what you are. When you become, I guess, friendlier with that person, you can ask questions about why. You find sometimes that it's something bothered them when they were a kid, or they've intellectualized their way to atheism. But there's more to life than intellect too. There's the revelation piece. There's the spirit, the faith. And I don't think I have a possibility of converting people. I'm not trying to convert them. I just want to get them to think. So often we hold points of view and they're not based on thinking. We hear them on the radio, so we profess them as truth. But I don't, what I try to encourage people to do is read, think, explore, probe, have conversations. And then you can come to your own conclusion. And maybe it's atheism at the end of the day. I hope not. Because I think sometimes when I think it must be lonely at times, because I always feel like I can fall back on my faith. And I wonder what I would do if I didn't have that faith.
But I imagine there's people listening who are saying, I don't know if I have the courage to do this. I mean, you've been doing it forever, right?
Sure. I mean, it's nice for me to stand here in front of the camera and say I've got so much courage, but there are plenty of times when I've been hesitant because it's not in the social mores to talk about faith necessarily. But what's funny, whenever I've done it, I remember this time we were at an agency and somebody used a term pejoratively. They said, "Oh, my Catholic guilt." And I said, "What do you mean by that?" Well, they didn't really know what they meant by that. And others were listening, and I just asked a couple of questions. By the end of the day, that conversation had run through a lot of the agency. So people were coming to either complain or to ask questions or to talk or to tell me I was wrong. But each one was an opportunity to have a conversation. I don't think I converted anybody that day, but I hope I got them to at least stop and think before they just say something.
I don't find a lot of pushback. Whenever I find an opportunity, the doors open a little, and I say, just throw something little out there. Honestly, 90% of the time, the face lights up. They're like happy to hear it. And then they know later they can come talk. And they do. Some do, some don't. But I mean, and then when people start to talk to you, guess what? Then your faith grows. At least I find that. So there's a benefit on both sides.
Yeah, I think you can almost test it out sometimes. It's easy with some people. It's harder with others. It might be easier with your family. It might be harder with your family. It might be easier with friends that you've grown up with. But you start talking to strangers, or you come to the workplace where it's not encouraged, and you become hesitant. I know I have. I mean, but each time I've done it, I've been glad I've done it. And once a conversation starts, then I'm happy.
And we're talking about the workplace, but this applies whether you're at your kids' sporting events, if you're working out at the gym, or you're at the neighborhood barbecue. I mean, this applies everywhere. Also applies in our homes, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
So when it's easy and hard, young children, it's easy to talk to them about faith. Then they get to be teenagers, and now everything's a pushback, and it gets a little tougher. And I think that what I would say to parents is hang in there, because you're fighting so many battles sometimes with teenagers, it's easy to just retreat. But you shouldn't retreat. You should keep that, I think, as part of the conversation. And they'll push back and they'll try to make you feel foolish because they're in a time of questioning and rebellion. But they'll get through that, and then they'll be adults. And I think it will have helped them to see that their parents hung on to their faith even when things got tough.
And I think too, there's a lot of parents maybe who say, I'm a good example, I go to church, I have my kids go to church, or even if, but I think it's really important too, though, to just talk about how God is in your everyday life. Like, for example, one of the things I find myself always saying to my kids, I think this was a quote from Pope John Paul, about the idea of, work as if everything depends on you, pray as if everything depends on God. And I always say that to my kids, because to me that's an example of bringing your faith into whatever you're doing, whether you're studying for a test, you're trying out for the basketball team, whatever it is. And you wonder, is it getting through? And then I heard one of my kids giving that advice to someone else. It's like, see, it does. But it's conversation. It's not just
you're
example.
Right. It is good to lead a life of faith by example. It is good to show people that you have a Christian way of acting or Christian beliefs. It takes a little more to talk about it, and I think it's so critical that we do. And like I say, we've all gone to our corners in this society. We don't talk about things that might make people feel uncomfortable, but as you said, it doesn't normally make people feel uncomfortable, and they might be looking for the opportunity, or they may never have known it. So you've opened a door by talking about it. And yeah, it's good to have faith and go to church or go to services or temple once a week. But you're supposed to live it all the time. So if you're supposed to live it all the time, how can you not talk about the most important thing in your life? You just keep that bottled up, and then once a week you let it out and pull it back in?
No, that's not it. And just kind of, I guess, to wrap up, because what you're reminding me of is, I think there's a fairly well-known quote attributed to Francis of Assisi, which says, if I get this right, preach the gospel or your faith at all times, and when necessary, use words. The thought being, of course, you need to be an example, right? And I totally agree that you need to be an example, but I believe that at this point in time, being a quiet example isn't enough anymore, that it is necessary to use words. So thank you for being here today. I appreciate it. And to those of you who tuned in, thank you for joining us. We are glad to have you.